I like Jim Kerr. Do you know Simple Minds?
No, but I work with a few.
The beloved British sitcom Are You Being Served entertained audiences for years with its witty humor and unforgettable characters. But behind the laughter lies a moment that changed everything. One infamous scene pushed the boundaries too far, sparking outrage and controversy that the producers never fully recovered from. What seemed like harmless comedy at the time quickly spiraled into heated debates, censorship battles, and ultimately the show's untimely downfall. Today, we revisit that shocking scene, uncovering why it ended a cultural phenomenon so abruptly. The scene that crossed the line. Are You Being Served thrived for over a decade on witty banter, cheeky innuendos, and eccentric characters. Yet, its downfall stemmed from one ill-fated scene. In the struggle to keep the show feeling new and exciting, the writers made a risky choice that crossed a dangerous line. They tried to mix humor built on racial stereotypes with a layer of sexual innuendo, hoping it would come across as daring and witty. But instead of playful mischief, the result felt crude, heavy, and deeply offensive. What might have been brushed off as cheeky in the earlier years of the sitcom now hits audiences with an uncomfortable thud. By the 1980s, Britain was already wrestling with racial unrest, immigration debates, and questions about how minorities were portrayed in public life. Representation mattered more than ever, and jokes that targeted race were no longer seen as harmless fun. They were reminders of real struggles and inequalities. So when the sitcom turned those sensitive issues into punchlines, it clashed sharply with the nation's shifting mood. Laughter quickly turned into silence, then into unease. For many viewers, the show's charm cracked that very moment. What was once a beloved symbol of light-hearted British humor became a painful reflection of society's divisions, and the sitcom never fully recovered from that turning point. For years, the show's humor had been described as harmlessly risque, a wink and a nudge, never truly meant to wound. But in this new cultural climate, the joke was not seen as harmless. It was seen as harmful. Audiences began to question the intent behind the laughter. Was this light-hearted humor, or was it perpetuating something darker? The reaction was swift and fierce. Viewers who once tuned in weekly now wrote angry letters. Critics who had tolerated the show's brand of bawdy comedy seized the moment to call it tasteless, outdated, and insensitive. The backlash was not universal. Some longtime fans defended the joke as just a bit of fun, but the tide had clearly shifted. What once had been charming now seemed crass. Inside the BBC, the reaction was even more telling. Executives, always careful to read the mood of the public, knew they had a problem. The risk of alienating a large portion of their audience, especially at a time when inclusivity and cultural sensitivity were becoming mainstream conversations, was too great. They could no longer defend the show in the way they once had. The trust that Are You Being Served had built with its viewers had cracked, and the fracture was impossible to repair. That single moment became the turning point. It was the scene that transformed the show from a cultural darling into a liability. What had once been celebrated as cheeky British humor suddenly felt like a relic of a less tolerant time. It wasn't just that one joke killed the show. It was that the joke revealed how much the cultural ground had shifted beneath it. Comedy had moved on, and Are You Being Served had not. Its downfall was not a gradual decline in quality, nor merely a loss of interest from viewers. It was the direct consequence of a moment when the humor that once united people began to divide them. And in the world of television, that can be fatal. Thus, the sitcom that had made millions laugh ended with a whisper of controversy. The laughter that had once echoed across Britain was replaced by debate, discomfort, and disappointment. That infamous scene remains a reminder of how fragile the line is between humor and harm, and how quickly a single misstep can topple even the mightiest of comedy giants. But how did the audience react to the scene that crossed limits? Did they just wave it off as a regular scene? Let's find out. From laughter to backlash. For many devoted fans, the controversial scene was nothing more than harmless entertainment. They argued that the outrage was exaggerated and blamed it on political correctness that, in their view, was choking the freedom of comedy. Yet, younger audiences and modern critics saw it very differently. To them, the jokes felt outdated, insensitive, and guilty of keeping harmful stereotypes alive. What once passed as innocent humor was now being judged under the sharper lens of today's social values. The debate raised a bigger, more unsettling question. Should comedy continue to challenge boundaries as it always has, or must it reshape itself to fit a world increasingly aware of fairness, representation, and cultural sensitivity? Caught in the middle of this storm was the BBC. For years, the broadcaster had tolerated and even celebrated the innuendo-laden humor of "Are You Being Served?" It had been a reliable ratings magnet, a staple of British comedy. But this time, the backlash was different. It was louder, angrier, and harder to ignore. For a network that prided itself on balancing tradition with progress and entertainment with responsibility, the show was beginning to look less like an asset and more like a liability. Each complaint, each editorial, and each heated panel discussion made it clear that the cultural tide had turned. The BBC could not simply laugh it off anymore. What made the situation so remarkable was not just the criticism itself, but what it represented. The laughter that once united living rooms across Britain was fading, replaced by unease. Viewers who had once delighted in the familiar faces of the department store staff now watched them with discomfort, unsure whether to chuckle or cringe. The characters who had once seemed timeless were beginning to feel like relics, trapped in a world that no longer existed. In many ways, the scandal surrounding the scene symbolized something larger than the fate of one sitcom. It spoke to Britain's ongoing struggle with its identity, its history, and its sense of humor. The debate was never just about one joke. It was about who gets to laugh, who gets laughed at, and whether comedy has an expiration date. Could a show built on the humor of an earlier era survive in a society that was moving forward faster than ever before? Or was this the inevitable end for a series that had outlived the cultural conditions that gave it life?
BBC Television Centre is a special building, and that's really what listing is all about. It was listed for its historic interest.
The truth is, the outrage revealed as much about the audience as it did about the show. Comedy, after all, has always thrived on tension. The tension between what can be said and what should not be said. In the 1970s, Are You Being Served? Played with those boundaries and became a national treasure. But by the time the infamous scene aired, the same tricks that once brought joy were now drawing fire. Britain had changed, and television, that ever-faithful mirror, reflected the change with brutal clarity. The laughter was not gone entirely, but it no longer rang with the same carefree abandon. It was strained, cautious, tinged with second thoughts. What was once a shared cultural joke had become a cultural question mark. What did the reaction from the audience result in? Is there a connection between the reaction and the end of the sitcom? Let's delve into the details of the end of an era. The sudden end of an iconic era. Are You Being Served? Once thrived as a cheeky emblem of British humor, built on innuendo and caricature. But one controversial scene exposed how much Britain had changed. Longtime fans defended the show as harmless satire, seeing backlash as political correctness gone too far. To them, the outrage symbolized comedy under siege. Yet younger audiences and critics saw the humor as outdated, even harmful, arguing it reinforced damaging stereotypes. The BBC, caught in the crossfire, faced mounting pressure. While once a ratings success, the sitcom now appeared out of touch with a society demanding greater cultural sensitivity. For the broadcaster, balancing entertainment with responsibility meant reassessing whether the show still had a place. The debate wasn't merely about one sitcom, it highlighted a broader cultural shift in how humor is judged, consumed, and challenged in a changing world. The controversy ultimately signaled the show's decline. Laughter once defined "Are you being served?" but shifting social tastes turned its humor into discomfort. By the mid-1980s, ratings declined, critics pounced, and the BBC faced mounting pressure to modernize. The infamous scene became a wake-up call. The sitcom's dated formula could no longer survive changing cultural expectations. In 1985, Are You Being Served? Aired its final episode. There was no glamorous farewell, no drawn-out goodbye tour. Instead, the ending was sudden, almost abrupt, as though the BBC wanted to close the book quietly without reigniting the controversy. For a show that had once been such a household name, its departure felt muted, even anticlimactic. For millions of fans, the cancellation was bittersweet. On one hand, they grieved the loss of a sitcom that had once delivered so much joy and laughter. On the other, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the spark had faded. The humor that once felt daring and fresh now seemed stale in comparison to newer comedies that reflected a changing Britain. The end, while sad, felt inevitable. The cast members moved on to other projects, some finding small successes, others fading into relative obscurity. Yet none of them ever managed to replicate the cultural lightning strike that Are You Being Served had achieved at its peak. For many viewers, reruns became a way to hold on to the past, offering a nostalgic escape into a time when laughter felt simpler and less burdened by controversy. But for others, those reruns carried an uncomfortable reminder of stereotypes that no longer had a place in modern storytelling. The sudden end of Are You Being Served left behind a complicated legacy. It was remembered both with affection and unease, a reminder of how even the most beloved shows can stumble when they fail to adapt to the times. For its fans, it would always be a treasure trove of classic comedy. For its critics, it stood as a cautionary tale about what happens when entertainment refuses to evolve with its audience. In the end, the show's fate underscored an unshakable truth. Television, like society itself, never stands still. What makes us laugh one decade might make us cringe the next. And in that shifting landscape, no comedy, no matter how iconic, can afford to stand still. Was the sitcom so special to have had criticisms from the audience? When did it start? Let's dive into the details of the events that preceded the sitcom. The birth, rise, and legacy of Are You Being Served? Sometimes the most iconic creations come from the simplest beginnings. The inspiration for Are You Being Served, one of Britain's most beloved sitcoms, can be traced back to a short but memorable chapter in the life of Jeremy Lloyd. In the early 1950s, Lloyd worked briefly at Simpsons of Piccadilly, a grand London clothing store that had served customers for more than 6 decades before finally closing its doors in 1999. The world of retail, with its strict hierarchies, eccentric staff, and endless parade of quirky customers, left such a lasting impression on Lloyd that he would later weave those experiences into comedy gold. Some also credit another department store, Clements of Watford, as an important source of inspiration. From there came the very idea for the unforgettable floor walker character, Captain Peacock, a man of stiff posture, unshakable rules, and old-fashioned authority. Are You Being Served? Almost never made it to air. The BBC initially shelved its pilot, uncertain of its appeal, until the tragic 1972 Munich massacre disrupted Olympic coverage. Needing filler, the BBC aired the pilot, and to everyone's surprise, audience loved it.
The Munich Olympics were going on, and there's a group called Black September, 8 members of Black September, kidnapped.
Encouraged, the network ordered a full series. Yet early struggles followed as the show was pitted against ITV's powerhouse Coronation Street. Ratings lagged until the BBC shifted it to a new time slot where the sitcom flourished. Viewers quickly embraced its cheeky humor, eccentric characters, and playful innuendos, transforming it into a ratings sensation. For 13 years, audiences tuned in faithfully, finding laughter in the antics of the fictional Grace Brothers department store. What began as a near-forgotten experiment became one of Britain's most beloved sitcoms. On the 1st April 1985, after years of episodes and specials, the curtain finally closed on its remarkable run. The cast played a monumental role in the show's legacy. Of the original group, 5 actors remained constants across all 69 episodes: Frank Thornton, Molly Sugden, John Inman, Wendy Richard, and Nicholas Smith. Their consistency gave the sitcom its heartbeat, each one contributing a unique flavor that viewers came to adore. Thornton's dignified Captain Peacock, Sugden's sharp-tongued Mrs. Slocum, Inman's flamboyant Mr. Humphreys, Richard's glamorous Miss Brahms, and Smith's comically hapless Mr. Rumbold together formed a chemistry that was both timeless and irreplaceable. Even after the show's conclusion, these 5 cast members continued to carry its spirit forward. They reunited in the sequel sitcom Grace and Favor, also known as Are You Being Served? Again, this continuation allowed fans to enjoy their favorite characters in a new setting, proving that the magic was still alive. Additionally, the cast's popularity extended beyond the regular series. On the 19th June 1976, they performed in character during a special stage sketch on the BBC One program Variety, further cementing their place as household names. Looking back, it is striking to see how close the world came to never experiencing this sitcom at all. A short-lived job in retail, a discarded pilot, and a tragic event that reshaped broadcasting schedules all played a part in bringing Are You Being Served to life. It is a reminder of how creativity often grows out of unexpected circumstances, and how chance can sometimes decide the fate of entertainment history. For over a decade, the sitcom not only entertained, but also became a snapshot of British humor, society, and culture of its time. It poked fun at the rigidity of class divisions, celebrated the quirks of everyday people, and gave audiences the gift of laughter week after week. The legacy of Are You Being Served endures, not just in reruns or spin-offs, but in the fond memories of millions who once gathered around their television sets to share in the mischief and mirth of Grace Brothers department store. When did the sitcom kick off? What made it possible for it to have such a wide acceptance? Let's dig into the details of Are You Being Served? A sitcom born in an era of change. When Are You Being Served? First appeared on BBC screens in 1972, very few could have guessed the storm it was about to create. Who would have thought that a sitcom about the daily mishaps of staff in a fictional London department store, Grace Brothers, would grow into a worldwide sensation? Yet, timing is everything. Britain in the early 1970s was in a state of transition. The 1960s had shaken up music, fashion, and cultural values, leaving behind an appetite for something different. The economy was uncertain, social traditions were being challenged, and audiences were yearning for entertainment that would let them escape the heaviness of everyday life. Into this atmosphere walked Are You Being Served? Bold, cheeky, and utterly unlike anything else on television at the time.
Are You Being Served kept a delighted audience in smutty innuendo for an incredible and appropriate 69 episodes.
The series found instant success because it dared to poke fun at things many shows avoided. Its comedy relied on playful innuendos, camp exaggerations, and slapstick routines that made people laugh at the absurdities of both retail life and British society itself. The setup was simple: a group of shop floor employees thrown together under bizarre store rules, constantly navigating class differences, awkward misunderstandings, and outrageous situations. But within that simplicity lay genius. Each character was deliberately larger than life, turning ordinary workplace struggles into pure comedy gold. Unlike many of its competitors, Are You Being Served didn't try to preach, moralize, or reflect the seriousness of the time. Instead, it served exactly what the public was craving: light-hearted humor with just enough mischief to keep it exciting. The show thrived on suggestion, double meanings, and situations that were just on the edge of being scandalous without fully crossing the line. Audiences, still used to fairly conservative television comedy, found this combination irresistible. As the seasons rolled on, the sitcom transformed from a simple workplace comedy into a true cultural landmark. It wasn't just a hit in Britain. It crossed oceans and found loyal fans in America, Canada, and Australia. Strangely enough, its very British eccentricities made it universally appealing. People everywhere could relate to the petty squabbles of co-workers, the overbearing bosses, and the ridiculous policies of corporate management. And its characters were impossible to forget. Mrs. Slocombe, with her ever-changing hair colors and her endlessly suggestive references to her pussy, became a household favorite. Mr. Humphreys, with his flamboyant personality and his famous catchphrase, "I'm free,"
Mr. Humphreys, are you free? I'm free,
became the show's beating heart and comic engine. Captain Peacock's pompous formality, Mr. Lucas's cheeky remarks, and the rest of the staff added layers to a cast that was equal parts dysfunctional family and comedy troupe. Together, they created a world so absurd, yet so familiar, that it kept audiences hooked year after year. Beyond the laughter, however, the show's brilliance was also its danger. Much of its humor leaned heavily on innuendos, stereotypes, and risque jokes. In the 1970s, this was groundbreaking and refreshing. But as decades passed and cultural sensitivities evolved, the same humor began to look risky, even outdated. What had once seemed daringly funny began to feel like a balancing act on a tightrope, constantly in danger of falling into controversy. Still, there's no denying the legacy of Are You Being Served? It wasn't just another sitcom, it was a product of its time, perfectly tuned to what audiences needed in an era of upheaval. It gave people permission to laugh at things they might otherwise never talk about. It carved out space for camp comedy on mainstream television, and it created characters and catchphrases that have outlived the show itself, embedding them into the fabric of British pop culture. In many ways, the show's success came from walking that delicate line, teasing, joking, and winking at taboos without ever completely crossing into them. It was precisely this balance that made the sitcom both iconic and controversial, ensuring that decades later it would still be remembered, debated, and celebrated as one of television's most daring comedies. The sitcom could boast of a collection of unique characters whose influence on the industry is greatly felt. Who were those characters? Let's delve into the details. The characters who defined a generation of comedy. At the very core of Are You Being Served was not just its clever writing or satirical edge, but a cast of characters so unforgettable that they became etched into the cultural memory of Britain and beyond.
1972, a landmark year for British entertainment.
Each personality was a mirror of society, stretched and exaggerated to comical extremes, yet still carrying an undeniable familiarity that made audiences laugh while secretly nodding in recognition. At the center of it all stood Mr. Wilberforce Claiborne Humphreys, played brilliantly by John Inman. With his flamboyant mannerisms and the catchphrase that became part of everyday language, "I'm free," Humphreys was more than comic relief. He was the heartbeat of the show.
It may not be technically the best take, but the reaction or the performance was the best.
His camp humor pushed boundaries in an era when such expression was rarely seen on mainstream television. While it relied heavily on stereotype, it also opened subtle conversations about identity, freedom of expression, and the nature of acceptance in a society that was only beginning to grapple with such themes. Beside him was the unforgettable Mrs. Slocombe, brought to life by Molly Sugden. With hair colors that seemed to change with the weather, and an endless supply of unintentional double entendres, particularly those revolving around her pussy, she was simultaneously the maternal figure and the wellspring of some of the show's most raucous laughter. Her prim, respectable exterior only made the innuendos land harder, cementing her as one of the true comic anchors of the series. Then there was Captain Peacock, portrayed by Frank Thornton. a man who embodied the stiff upper lip and the obsession with decorum that defined a generation of middle management. Always keen to enforce rules and maintain a sense of hierarchy, his pomposity was routinely skewered by the ridiculous situations around him. In his character, audiences saw a playful mockery of authority figures everywhere: bosses, bureaucrats, and the endless parade of rule keepers who so often took themselves too seriously. Hovering above it all was Mr. Rumbold, Nicholas Smith's bumbling store manager. He was the man who wanted desperately to command respect, but whose nervous energy and constant missteps made him more pitiful than powerful. His every attempt at control dissolved into chaos, reminding viewers of every inept leader they had ever worked under, making him as familiar as he was funny. Balancing this colorful ensemble was Miss Brahms, the young and glamorous junior staff member played by Wendy Richard. Her sharp tongue and youthful flair provided a striking counterpoint to the older employees. Where others clung to tradition, she embodied rebellion and modernity. In her, audiences saw the generational divide laid bare, the tension between old-world formality and the brash confidence of a new era. Together, these characters did not simply act out skits. They created a rhythm of comedy that resonated deeply with audiences. Their interactions turned a department store floor into a microcosm of British society, where generational differences, class tensions, and the absurd rituals of retail bureaucracy were brought into the spotlight and exaggerated until they became hilariously absurd. Yet, what made them endure far beyond their time on air was not just the laughter they produced, but the way they reflected real life. Viewers could point to their own bosses, co-workers, or even neighbors and say, "That's him," or "That's her." The comedy struck so true because it was rooted in recognizable reality. But comedy, like society, is never static. As the years passed, tastes evolved, and the very exaggerations that once seemed bold and hilarious began to feel outdated, sometimes even uncomfortable. The same characters who had once been celebrated for their daring humor slowly became lightning rods for criticism, as audiences reconsidered what was acceptable in a shifting cultural landscape. And then came the moment that defined the show's decline. One scene that dared to push too far. A scene that forced both fans and critics to pause and wonder whether the laughter had crossed the line. The TV show, before it ended, featured controversies, made people laugh, and taught everyone lessons. What do lessons did the sitcom TV show teach? Let's find out. The legacy. Decades after it first lit up television screens, Are You Being Served? Still sparks lively conversations. To some, it's an untouchable treasure of British comedy, a golden reminder of a time when television dared to be cheeky, flamboyant, and unapologetically playful. For others, it serves as a warning, a reminder of what happens when humor leans too heavily on stereotypes, recycled gags, and cultural jokes that don't always age well. This split opinion has kept the show alive in public debate long after its final episode aired, ensuring that its influence and controversy remain impossible to ignore. At the center of its legacy lies the infamous scene that effectively brought the curtain down on the series. That moment has since grown into something larger than the show itself, a piece of television folklore, whispered about as both a cautionary tale and a bold reminder of comedy's fragile balance. Comedy, after all, has always walked a thin tightrope between entertainment and offense. One step too far, and what was once celebrated as daring suddenly feels distasteful. This very scene forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable but necessary questions. Should comedy reflect the culture of its time, even if that culture now feels outdated? Or should it be bold enough to challenge the status quo, regardless of the risk? And perhaps most importantly, where exactly is the line between clever boundary pushing and harmful offense? What makes Are You Being Served? Particularly fascinating is how, despite these questions, the show continues to find fans all around the world. For many viewers, especially those outside of Britain, it's less about debates over taste and more about a longing for nostalgia. the colorful costumes, the exaggerated wigs, the instantly recognizable catchphrases. All of these weave together into a time capsule of television's lighter, less complicated days. To those audiences, the show isn't a scandal or a statement. It's comfort. It's a portal back to evenings spent laughing with family, to simpler times when television was less self-conscious and more focused on pure entertainment. This nostalgia was powerful enough that in 2016, the BBC attempted to recapture the original spark with a one-off revival, aptly titled, "Are You Being Served?" Again, the decision alone was proof that the show's cultural weight had not faded, even decades later.
Proper, quintessential British slapstick humour.
But while the revival stirred curiosity and earned the attention of longtime fans, its reception was far from unanimous. Some viewers welcomed the familiar faces, the bright sets, and the same playful tone. Others, however, found it forced, a reminder that comedy magic is not something easily bottled and remade. The mixed reviews highlighted a truth many already suspected. The original Are You Being Served? Had thrived in a particular cultural moment, and no revival could ever fully recapture the same lightning in a bottle. Ultimately, the series occupies a rare and fascinating position in television history. It was bold, it was daring, it was outrageously funny, until, for many, it wasn't anymore. Its rise and fall stand as a powerful reminder of how comedy is never fixed. It is alive, constantly shifting with the sensibilities of the audience watching it. What makes one generation howl with laughter might make another recoil in discomfort. What once felt progressive can later seem dated. And what once carried charm can, in a new context, carry controversy. The legacy of Are You Being Served is therefore twofold. On the one hand, it will always be remembered as a comedy classic, a program that dared to be silly, flamboyant, and larger than life. On the other, it will forever serve as a warning that every joke carries weight. Laughter is powerful, but so is offense. In the end, it took just one controversial scene to remind the world of comedy's fragility. A single misstep, a single poorly received moment was enough to silence a cultural giant. That is perhaps the greatest lesson of Are You Being Served? Comedy is never just about making people laugh. It is about timing, context, and responsibility. And sometimes, one joke, just one, can bring it all crashing down. So, what do you think about the infamous scene? Is it worth it? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.